Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to listen to it again later. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll get to as many as we can before the end of today's event. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is 4 steps. How to value stream map your software pipelines. Our speaker today is Marc Hornbeek, who is the CEO of Engineering DevOps Consulting, author and Engineering DevOps, and I'm sure I got that all wrong, but sorry about that, Marc. And he's being joined by Jeff Keyes, who is Director of Product Marketing at Plutora. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Marc. How are you guys doing today?
Hi.
Wonderful. Awesome.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to put myself on mute, let you guys get to it.
Well, fantastic. I love this topic, by the way, and I'm just glad that I get to walk this through so you understand my perspective. I'll ask a lot of questions, but I'll ask it from a perspective of being well, frankly, a programmer who's done it all wrong and wished he could persuade the whole room to develop pipelines in a certain way because I thought I knew what was right and struggled with getting people on board. And I remember reading Kent Beck about you should do value stream mapping, and I was like, whatever. I never really got it. I didn't get it until later in life. What's fun about today is we get to work with Marc Hornbeek, who's done a lot of these sessions, who's work through a methodical process of helping people through doing value stream mapping sessions. So thus we have a series that we're doing of webinars. This one is the first, which is how do you set up a current state value stream map and how do you run the process, after which we'll have a future state where you propose the solutions, and then we'll go through some examples in the third webinar about you know, some examples of key findings and so forth. So use this as your guide. You know, this is, if you've never done value stream mapping before, this is a great intro. If you have, okay, you'll get some new tidbits on where to go, how to do the calculation and so forth. Introducing Marc, he's coming out with a book, and this should be out in, well, gosh, in just another week here, right? If you're going to Enterprise Summit in Vegas, you can actually stop by the Plutora booth and pick up a copy. You can also reserve a copy on Engineering DevOps, but it's a great book. Got a lot of cool blueprints on how you actually do DevOps transformations. Is that accurate, Marc? Anything you wanted to say about that?
No, I should be paying you for the advertising, I guess. Thanks for the opportunity to talk here and point that out. Sure. So yeah, sure. Pick up a free copy or order one online would be even better.
Awesome.
But this book was kind of driven from the, you know, there was an interesting article published this morning. I blogged about it a little bit. You know, somebody said, has DevOps lost its groove? And the issue is that a lot of people are frustrated, but we've been talking about DevOps for so long, but how do you actually do it? There's certainly lots of failure cases, probably more failure cases than success cases. So yep. Value stream mapping is central to the idea of engineering DevOps, and you know, provides a prescription for how do you actually do DevOps successfully, no matter where you're starting from or where you want to get to. It provides a prescription for that. It's kind of an engineering approach, more disciplined approach, and value stream mapping is central to that. So everything we're talking about here in this webinar is actually covered in the book, in some portions of the book.
Which is kind of cool, which takes us to what are you going to learn? Hey, what's a value stream map? Why do I care? How do you create them and what kind of results? And ultimately, you've heard this, you're trying to find the bottlenecks and how do you improve those? So we're going to go through that. So with that, take us through this, Marc. What's a value stream map? Give us the background here. How, you know, what's going on?
Well, first of all, that's a good point. The background. I was looking at that this morning. Sorry, I just had my fans blowing my papers all over the place here. I'm coming to you from lovely Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, in my office. Anyway, value stream mapping is not new. It was, I think, the first examples that people point to were like 1918. A guy called Charles Nopel, and he was just talking about how to document process flows for manufacturing in that case. And there's lots of interesting books in that been written since on value stream mapping. Probably the most recent one on value stream mapping in particular is Karen Martin and Mike Osterling. They wrote a book called Value Stream Mapping. Value stream mapping has been applied to many, many things, but it's essentially just a way of visualizing a process flow and makes it really easy to understand. So you define the steps in your process, try not to make it too complex, even though in reality, we all know business processes are particularly complex. And if by doing that and doing it collaboratively, because all these processes usually involve a cross-functional team. So the idea is to really do this collaboratively, and you end up with a lot of learning that goes on about what your own processes are, and that helps you identify bottlenecks when it's applied to things like DevOps and software delivery, continuous delivery pipelines and things like that. So basically, it helps you with the idea of finding bottlenecks to pull out the waste from a lean pipeline.
What I found interesting is, are you surprised at how often people all get in a room and they don't really get the process that software goes through from backlog to production, and how often are you seeing that where people are like, oh, I didn't know we do all those steps?
100% of the time. There's always resistance, like, oh, another meeting. Do we have to go? And then they get in the room, and actually, this is one of those meetings that tends to be really popular once you get into it. It's like, wow, this is interesting. I didn't know we did it this way. I thought that only took you guys 2 days, or I thought it took you 2 months. When you start mapping it out and realizing how things interactions across the steps, and it's almost invariably enlightening for everyone. Somebody's learning something. So I actually find the value stream map process and workshops fun. Everybody seems to like them by the time they're done, even though they come into it sort of like wishing they didn't have to go to that meeting.
Right. Well, because the first thought is it's just a waste of time, and that I got to get stuff done. And it's like, well, wait a minute, why do I care? So how does doing this mapping fit into a DevOps transformation?
Yeah, so one thing I would point out is, the simple value stream map that was presented on the previous slide, they always look kind of simple like that in the end, but in reality, there's a lot of complexities going on. And if you take DevOps, and I have this blueprint in my book, it's a multi-level thing. There are value streams within value streams and interacting value streams. The idea is to try to pick a value that you're really trying to, improve. But if you take the DevOps situation, at the lower end, you've got infrastructure that all things run on, whether it's cloud or whatever. And then you've got a pipeline of things all the way from planning through the integration stages and, delivery and operations. And then you've got release management. And then on top of that, you got value stream management orchestrating the whole, the whole shebang.
Sure.
So you can have value streams at each of those levels and sub value streams, but the idea is, if you're doing value stream mapping well, you really think about what is the value stream that you really want to improve. Where's the biggest bottleneck most likely? Where's there the most interest in resolving the issues? And then it can all make sense. But keep in mind the big picture while you're doing it, because there's a lot of interactions going on. You do want to build a simple diagram. You don't want to end up with something too complex, or it's not really going to be helpful. Right. But on the other hand, you want to make sure you pick the right level. So it's going to have the most value for you.
Well, that's awesome. Let's get to so why do I care about value stream mapping?
It's really a great little tool. I mean, I remember even in college and everything, until I could write down the course in one diagram, I didn't really understand it. If you can write down your process in one diagram, it's really powerful. Everybody can relate to it and say, yeah, I was there, I understand that, that makes sense. And it really, becomes a go-to diagram for things like bottleneck identification improvements. But in general, it gives you a way to also play with what if scenarios. What if you were to make this change, that change? If that stage was faster, or this, stage delay was shorter, you can start building future state models, and then you can say, well, what would I have to do to get there? So it gives you a more objective way of tackling the end-to-end pipeline, rather than just looking at it as what is the result, and then not really figuring out where to tackle. It applies to a lot of different things. Certainly it applies to software delivery pipelines and DevOps. And the neat thing is, if you build the value stream map, you can directly use it with value stream management tools. It integrates well because you've already identified what stages need to be managed, for example. So value stream mapping has a lot of different values. It also is just fun. It's some way to get the organization together, do a little project together, even if you don't have a cross-functional team structure. It's a way to get cross-functional team discussions going on in a way that's positive.
That's exactly what I've observed is, it's that when you get a cross-functional team looking at a problem, it unifies the team behind that single problem, which is we've got to solve whatever this problem X is, and everybody starts pointing to where they think the bottlenecks are, which is great. If you're involved in wanting to fix things, now that you've immortalized what the process is, and everybody's pointing to the same goal. Wow, what a great tool to get everybody on the same page for just a simple little diagram. It does take a little bit of time, but in getting to what it takes to actually create it, how do you make one? Here's the whole thing in 4 steps. How do you make a value stream map?
So there are different ways. I mean, the book I mentioned, it talks about different approaches, and a lot of folks use a whiteboard, or they use sticky notes, different things. What I do is I just use PowerPoint, which is kind of cool, because then it doesn't require everybody's necessarily in the same room. You can do it over a webinar or just a web meeting setting. So I have some templates. I go into the meeting with some templates of generic value stream, and start capturing information and draw it and build the diagram as you go, and interactively with the team. I find that works really well. Usually I can come up with a pretty comprehensive value stream map within a couple of hours, no more than 4. With a team typically size of anywhere from 8 to 25 is pretty normal. And you can actually get a fair level of consensus if you build the diagrams together. So that's a general point. The steps really are, first of all, it is a cross-functional effort. So you do need to know who the players are. You can't invite everybody to the room. So you need to pick the players, and I'll talk about that. And then you need to prepare, get them ready, give them some collateral, maybe send them this webinar, for example, and tell them, what is it that you're going to be measuring that needs to be decided, and what's the value that you're going to build the value stream around, and how are you going to measure those values. I'll talk about that in a minute too. And then conduct the workshop. The workshop itself doesn't have to take more than, like I say, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours typically. It doesn't have to be like an all-day event. People can still do their day jobs, but very collaborative, interactive effort. And there's often action items taken. You find out that there's some data that you don't have, nobody has in the room, but you can figure it out and get it, fill it in later. And finally, once you have all the data, which usually occurs a little bit later, because some of that data might have been missing in the workshop, you can, the orchestrator of the work can document the result and come back together and get a consensus on what it looks like.
You bet. Hey, and you put in here a key piece, which is select a value to be analyzed. Can you expand on that a bit? What's that mean, and how do you get the team to understand, what value is and what's being delivered?
So the traditional value, if value stream maps were designed for it, would be like the product itself. Like there's some value that you're producing something and the customer wants it, so that's the value. The value is the product itself, and what are the steps to get there. But value stream mapping is used for a lot more than that. You can use the same technique, which is what we're doing here, around almost anything. You pick a value, and then you can say, well, let's map out the process for that thing. It could be lead time, it could be quality, it could be even satisfaction or efficiency. Pick something that you think is important to the group, that you want to improve, and identify that as a value. I have a slide on that as well later, but that's the idea. You can have different values throughout the organization that are important, and they still interact. That can get complex, but it's nice if you can all agree on what is the value you're really trying to improve and build improvements around that.
Gotcha. And is this like a one-time thing that you do? Is this what's your cadence of this, or what's it look like?
It's not waterfall days anymore. Basically, it's kind of agile in the big picture sense. I mean, you do a value stream map for some leg in your DevOps journey, and then revisit it before you go on to the next one. In theory, that's the best way to do it. So you may decide, hey, wait a minute, we improved lead time. Now our bottleneck is quality, or now our bottleneck is efficiency, or stability, or security. And maybe the next value stream map when you get together is so focus on those things instead.
What a great way to get the team together. So I guess this means we're going to have somebody that's going to lead the value stream mapping session, and I'm presuming that's going to be, maybe a lot of the people on the line. So what's it take to actually understand, how to lead a value stream mapping session?
Yes, there's a lot of politics in organizations and jealousies, I would say. So you want a leader that is sensitive to those things. When you pull together a cross-functional team, whoever's leading it needs to be. It's not just a technical discussion. It's a human discussion around technical things and technical processes. But whoever the leader is needs to be someone that has that stature. That he doesn't have to be the boss. Maybe it's not a good idea to be the boss. He needs to be a facilitator type personality that is sensitive to, the particular organization's sensitivities. Sometimes there are underlying politics going on.
Right.
You don't necessarily want to put the elephant on the table, but you want to be sensitive to it as you go through it.
Right. Well, because the goal is to draw people in, right? You want to get everybody collaborating.
Yeah. So the person also needs to have some understanding of the application that's being discussed. Clearly, basic things like communication skills, understands the idea. So usually it's a senior consultant or someone in the organization that is equivalent to that to do a proper value stream exercise. Anybody can do it. I'm just saying that, these are the characteristics that make it most successful typically.
Yeah, people can call you and bring you in as well, just for a value stream mapping session too, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we do offer workshops, yeah.
Very cool. So, well then, all right, who's going to be involved? If we've got a leader that we've got that's a pro, or we just want to practice, then great. But who all do we want to have involved in this session?
So again, it's a cross-functional effort. None of these processes, if there's only one person involved, then I guess you wouldn't need the meeting.
Correct.
Fundamentally, you're going to have some management players. You're going to have some key influencers that maybe not in a management level, but they're influencers regarding the particular, whatever the value is. It's all about the value again. If the value is lead time, then pick people that can contribute to, lead time discussions, right? How fast things take and how to speed them up. So you're often going to have the product owner. Certainly, you're going to have people from the different portions of the end-to-end value stream. So it's usually in the DevOps world, it's going to be dev and ops and the tools people, infrastructure, QA, management, people that have release authority. They're all going to have some stake in the game. When you start talking about changing the value stream, even just to document the current one, they're going to have information that's important. Now, don't worry about their titles. It's more important that you get the right people.
Yep.
And really try to ensure that the people that attend are of a nature to be cooperative, and not if they are a political sort, they need to have some pre-coaching to put aside their political attitudes prior to the meeting, because that's so disruptive when you get one person trying to dominate the meeting because of their personal biases. So that's important too.
Yeah, I hope what you're hearing out of this is the requirement to enlist, because as it said, culture eats process for lunch. So if you're trying to make a technology change, oftentimes it's the culture change and the personalities that you're trying to influence. And this is as much about that and getting people involved as it is about actually fixing the process.
Well, yeah, I would interrupt there a little bit because it's so important. Often I have found that these value stream mapping sessions are the first time some people have got together across their organization. They've complained about each other for years.
Right.
And then they finally come into a meeting to actually do a little project together, and they come out of the room a little more friendly to each other. It's
Which
actually,
is, it's like you're
yeah.
playing camp counselor, right? You know, okay, kids, stop fighting and let's find a way to work together, which is why your leaders is so important. He's got to be able to
Yeah.
bridge that gap.
That's right.
So, well, looking at the kind of things that I want to analyze, give me a walkthrough of some of these. I mean, you kind of mentioned these, but tell me what these kind of mean.
Well, these are the items that I often refer to, and certainly in the book and the DevOps, my DevOps practice. But there are 6 categories of values or goals, you could call them, in DevOps these are derived from the State of the DevOps report. So you can identify them as time to market, quality, stability, efficiency, security, satisfaction. So there's literally 6, and there are some, refinements on each of those, but those are basically the primary values that I see people wanting to improve. Time to market is by far and wide the most popular one.
Yeah,
they want
go
to shorten
faster,
the lead
right?
time, go faster. And then usually quality follows behind that, because as you go faster, you find out that things break.
Right.
So that becomes the next one, and they often try to do both at the same time. You're trying to take care of everything as you go, but in reality, if you try to focus on 6 things at once, it doesn't work. You focus on one, and then you checkpoint the others to make sure they don't get worse, at least. So time to market, for example, you're usually looking at the process time, how long it takes to process an item, how long it takes, in calendar time to do that, which may be a different time. It may take you only 2 minutes to do something, but that 2 minutes has to be scheduled, so the total task might be a day. Even so, process time is 2 minutes and lead time is a day. And then there may be wait times as well. Like, I can't start it until Fred has finished with what he's doing. So those are examples of measurements. It's not good enough just to identify a value. You also have to agree on how you're going to measure it. That's important for the analysis in these value stream maps.
Gotcha. So how do you decide between, where to start? What's your process?
So, yeah, so this was actually from the prior webinar we did together. A lot of people disagree on what the value should be, and that's typically the starting point. Like, how do we agree on what is the value? So we actually have a little tool that walk through, again, collaboratively with the team, all the different types of goals or values, and get them to force rank it, and then say, okay, if do we all agree that, let's say in this particular diagram, agility was the number 1, so we're going to focus on that.
Sure.
So this is a good way to kind of get alignment on the value before we start making a map of it.
So see prior webinar, and you can learn about this tool more. Well, and that kind of takes us into actually doing the workshop. When we're doing this, I mean, here's the most fundamental question, right? How do I decide what the stages are?
That's a tough one sometimes. I mean, although it usually requires a little bit of coaching. There's some science, if you like, pseudoscience behind it. A stage really should be something that has a defined start and defined end.
Okay.
And there may even be some overlap between the start of one and the end of the other, but there should be at least some criteria that says, okay, that part is done. If there isn't, it's kind of hard to call it a stage.
Right.
Yeah. And so then if you have, a defined stage, and there shouldn't be too many either, by the way. If it gets too complex, then this doesn't work. It's a visual tool. So there are software tools out there that can handle value streams with hundreds of steps, but that's not really, I don't find that very helpful.
Unmanageable at that point.
It's not manageable. It's not really, I haven't found that very helpful. It's better to get it down to like 5 to 15 steps, something you can actually put on a diagram. I kind of try to keep it under 10, but the idea is to try to pick, something break it down into like 15 steps maximum,
Yeah.
And each stage has a defined start, a defined end, even if there's some overlap, but at least you can define when one is done. And you can also define the input criteria for the next one. So to me, that's the definition of a stage. It has a defined input criteria, and it has a clear, definition of when it's done that can be measured.
Gotcha. One of the critiques I hear, of course, is, oh, well, it seems really waterfallish, and we're doing agile.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so indeed, people I think overuse this word waterfall, but fundamentally waterfall is nothing other than, you do everything serially and you don't start the next thing until you finish the last thing. And this diagram sort of implies that, so I can understand why the question exists. But I don't care whether it's agile or waterfall or whatever, you still have to do, one thing before you finish the other. You can't, test the code before you have the code, for example. There are things that have logical steps, and in the case of DevOps, they're fairly obvious. Typically,
Right.
you're going to plan before you code. You're going to code before you finish testing, at least. There's certainly TDD and all of that, but you're not going to finish system testing until you have the code. And you're going to do integration, and you're going to have packaging for delivery, and you're going to have a delivery, and you're going to have operations. So there are actually steps, whether it's agile or not. So I do argue that this is not waterfall, even though it does tend to look like a serial diagram.
Yep.
It's still useful to break it down this way.
Understood. And I'm noticing some metrics there at the bottom. You talk about that a bit, this LTPT.
Right. So lead time is nothing other than the time, calendar time for a process. So let's say it was integration. If you submitted a commit to a build system and it took an hour to make a build, that the lead time would be an hour.
Okay.
Whereas maybe the actual time it was being using the computer was only 10 minutes because the computer's shared with others. So the process time is only 10 minutes. So you can see that there's a waste, there's an efficiency there. From the point of view of that particular value stream, that's only 10% efficient at that stage, because you're waiting 90% of the time for the chance to run the build. So that's just an example of what that means. Non-value added time is really just wait time in between stages. So if you were, let's say, you got code ready, but you want to test it, but you don't have the test environment yet, so you request it, and eventually it comes available, and then you can start. So you can't start the next stage. That's what non-value added time is. And then the other little thing, I can never remember what it means myself, C over A, but I know what it means. I don't remember the acronym.
The percent complete and accurate, yeah.
The general idea is that it's the percent of the results of the prior stage that are usable without rework. So it's an indication of quality. So in other words, if you had a C over A of 90%, then 90% of the results from the prior stage is usable in the stage without rework. That's, if it was 10% of it, say the previous stage is a serious problem, like only 10% of the work is usable. So that's what it means anyway.
Awesome. Well, and looking at this, how do you identify, the tactics to support those, the improvements? Because it's what kinds of things are you asking about when you're looking at, what's going on in each stage?
So when you do the value stream map, you shouldn't only, often the engineers in the room want to talk about just the technical piece, but you've really got to also think about what's contributing to the bottlenecks, what's contributing to whatever the value is, if it's if it's quality or whatever it is. And don't just think about the tech piece, think about your process and the people, and make sure you jot down all of those things that are contributing factors, that are prevalent factors. That's all this chart is really saying. Don't just think about the technology.
In other words, just because the tool, that particular tool, only does this, doesn't mean that's the only way to, look at it.
Yeah, exactly. It may be that there's some people stuff that's dominating the delay more than the technology. Maybe it's because, Fred takes vacation a lot or something.
Right.
Whatever the reason, right? Or maybe it's because that particular conference room that you always meet in is always busy. Whatever it is, right? It may not be just tech. It may not be. You can't only look at the tech.
Well, let's look at this in practice then. So, putting all these things together, what's an example of lead time? And show me how this all kind of fits together. Give me a layout. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is an actual example. I can't name names, but this is a financial services company where we reviewed one of their applications, pipeline value stream, and this is a high-level map of that. The team reviewed at the backlog level. They were reviewing priorities and resources and assignments, and that's what was consuming the time. So it was a manual review at the dev stage. It was basically coding, inspecting, unit testing, and all of that. So you basically jot down what are the major contributing factors to, in this case, lead time, and they came up with some numbers. 4 hours of lead time and 1 hour of process time. And a lot of the difference was, hey, we needed to get together for the meeting. We had to gather people together. So the difference between 4 and 1 was basically getting people together. And you can kind of go through the rest of the stages and see the same thing. The dev stage looks like it's very long, 72 hours to make a change, and 48 hours of that was actual process time. The rest of it was, getting ready and getting your environment set up and things like that. The CI stage, 18 hours of actual lead time and 6 hours of process time. So you can sort of look at that and say, whoa, where are the big times being spent? It looks like dev is, a big one, and operations is a big one. Maybe that's where you should make improvements. The delays and non-value added times look like between dev and CI, you got a request for waiting for resources for testing, and again, between delivery and deployment, waiting for resources for deployment. So these are the sort of things you do. You just write down your stages, and then figure out what are the contributing factors and how long are those things taking.
Gotcha. Well, and a question on that. I mean, where do these numbers come from? How did you get data for this?
Well, yeah, it's obviously a current state survey, so people have to come with their numbers, and often they may not have them. There may be a homework assignment to go get them, or a couple of phone calls. It's usually the case, and they may be estimates. And to be honest with you, the absolute numbers are not as important as the relative numbers, because what you're trying to look for is % improvement overall. So the most important thing is that the team is comfortable that this is representative, at least on a relative scale, of what their value stream looks like. If they have absolute numbers, that's cool, but in reality, there's almost no such thing as absolute numbers anyway. They tend to vary. If you have a small change going through, it might only take minutes, and a big change might take days. But these are kind of like the team's estimate of their average. And the most important thing is that they can stand back and look at it and say, yeah, this does seem to fairly represent our typical case, at least on a relative scale.
Gotcha. And just to make sure I got these numbers right, for example, on the backlog, you got 4 hours of lead time with 1 hour of process time, which leads to 3 hours of waste, and right on through. What's this 80% number here?
Well, that's the C/A. That's the % of those changes that were accepted without change.
So and how do you get that? Where's that?
Backlog. Again, it's from just talking to the team, and they may have metrics on some of these things. Some of them may not actually have metrics, but if it was an agile tool, they might be able to see how many of their Jira or something, how many of their changes are getting rejected and require rework from the tool. That may not be true in every step, right? Because as you go through the whole value stream, there's different tools involved typically. So usually it's, that's why you need the cross-functional team. Whoever's the local expert for that area needs to come up with some numbers.
Sure, and it's somewhat subjective, but it's going to use data as a background for it to kind of say, well, we think it's about this, and you'll get real numbers at that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so how do you calculate these lead time, and let's talk about calculating lead time and process time then.
Right. So the main thing I want to point out here is, the math is simple. I don't think going through the math is that helpful, but I want to point out that what you're really trying to do is not, over focus in one area. Excuse me. You're really trying to optimize end to end. So the first thing you want to do is reevaluate all of these numbers in terms of its end-to-end significance, right? So it's not, if you were to just look at the raw numbers, you might say, oh, what's most important is that 72-hour number. It's a big, time. But in reality, the dev stage in this case it's fairly efficient. 48 hours process time, 72 hours lead time.
Mm-hmm.
It's 67% efficient. There may not be a lot of low-hanging fruit there to improve, but the CI stage, which is only 18 hours, it's only 33% efficient. So it may be faster and easier to make some improvements there. Depending on what your goals are, that may be enough. So that's something to constantly look at when you're doing the analysis. Where's the low-hanging fruit? Where are you most likely going to get easy gains? And usually it's going to be where you've got, a larger difference between, as a ratio between the process time and the lead time. And then, of course, the total waste is still interesting. So if you can think of a good way to attack total waste, then that 24-hour waste is valuable to look at, right? The other thing to look at is where you've got common factors. So the non-value time of 16 hours by itself may not be huge, but it's still significant. If you look at the fact that really the same thing's going on between dev and CI and delivery and deploy, it's really an environment orchestration problem. The total is very significant. So you want to look for those opportunities as well, where there's a common solution might address some of these smaller numbers, and then in total they become worth addressing. You total them up and say, wow, that as a total percentage of your end-to-end waste, it's significant, and maybe that's what you should tackle. So that's why you do want to do a few what-if calculations at this point before you decide where you're going to focus solutions.
That's great. So what do you end up with then when you're getting this done? How do you, when you're doing this, say, for a different thing than lead time, and you're going to do quality, what's it look like?
So quality in this diagram, at least, it's a little easier, because if you've got it boiled down to the C over A, the percent of results that are usable, it's pretty much just taken right off the chart. You can say what are the biggest areas for improvement. In this case, the lowest numbers are most important. So 65%, 55% are areas that improve, and just be aware that you're talking about improvements in the prior stage, not the current stage in this case. So if only 65% of the output of dev is passing CI, then you want to look at your dev process and see what can we improve so that we can get that number up.
You bet. Well, give us some key tips. As you've done this, give us some wisdom.
Yeah, so I sort of alluded to some of that as I went along. The most important thing is, again, don't just look at the individual numbers, look at them as a ratio of the end-to-end values, because you're really trying to optimize end-to-end flow, not just an individual stage. So give priority in your solutions to things that have a high, impact end-to-end. Be concerned about, don't be so concerned about the absolute precision, because it doesn't really exist anyway. What's most important is the team can stand back and look at it and say, yeah, this seems to be representative of our current state typically. There's always going to be outliers. There's no point in spending a whole lot of time talking about outliers. You're trying to find out what's the typical case and make sure the team is satisfied that that's a fair representation. Do look for back-to-back bottlenecks. Sometimes when you've got, maybe the individual bottlenecks are not that high, but if you total 3 major, significant bottlenecks in a row, there may be some opportunity. There's maybe a common solution that you can get a lot of gains for low effort.
Sure.
And then the common areas as well, where you've got things like I mentioned, where you've got fairly small waste values, but one solution would tackle multiple instances, and in total it's worth solving. So those are just some examples of things that are not obvious at first glance when you're doing these things.
Very cool. Well, we were going to do a survey, but I'm going to ignore that. So we're going to get right into, all right, take us through a real life example and give us the story here, because this is interesting.
This is an actual customer, digital archive. I won't mention the name of the customer. And again, it's a typical case. You get into the room, and we had fair representation. Not everybody in this case was represented in the meeting from all different cross-functional groups, but there was a fair representation. And a lot of disagreement as to what the actual process was, and getting it boiled down to these numbers and these content. So
that's back to the surprise of you do what?
right. Yeah. So the first thing was to decide, what are we trying to improve? Was it all the way end to end from backlog through to delivery or not? And we agreed that no, we're going to look at the lead time between start of function, well, basically the end of coding and unit test until delivery is ready. So that's the first thing, lesson learned. Make sure you know what is the segment of the value stream that you're really going to focus on.
Sure.
And then you really jump into that. So we found out that in the function and acceptance test stage after code in unit testing, there was a lot of manual testing going on, even creating the test. So they didn't have the test at the end of coding. So there's clearly an opportunity there to make some improvements to parallel test creation with coding, and then preparing for the deployment at the same time as integration. So the parallel effort is good, but the problem is some of the integration artifacts aren't available yet. So there's some mismatch in timing and system integration and performance. After integration does make sense, and it's fairly low amount of total time, but in this case we're dealing with a fairly short total time anyway. Their current state was only 14 hours, and trying to get it down to 7 hours. Deployment, to try to get the deployment process a little more automated. At the moment they was using tickets, so there'd be an opportunity to automate that with things like value stream mapping tools, automating and orchestrating the actual process, and validating what's been deployed. So automating some of the deployment scripts and tests post-deployment are all opportunities. When you get down to lead times of 14 hours, you're trying to, you're clearly getting to a situation where you're talking about automation. Not a lot of manual processes are going to make improvements in 14 hours. So it's pretty much all an automation play. Where do we want to concentrate our automation efforts? And there's also some opportunity for restructuring the pipeline. If you look, like I mentioned, maybe functional and acceptance testing could come together with coding, and so you have more like a CI, automated kickoff, rather than manual work, and things like that.
Yeah. Wow. So that one's pretty simple, and they're already doing pretty well if they're just looking at a lead time of 14 hours. Let's look at one that's a little more messy. Because I think this is where most of the enterprises are. It's like, oh my gosh, what do I walk us through this one?
Yeah, so this is definitely more messy. This is a large financial firm, and the red is basically where they aren't really using best practices. So there's a lot of red in every one of the stages. Again, their starting point goals were not realistic. Their estimate of their current state was also not realistic. When we started mapping it out, we found out that there's, the current state is taking a lot longer than they estimated. Again, it was a lead time, a value that was being analyzed. A lot of time in test creation and coding. Again, this one comes up a lot. Honestly, many organizations just haven't invested in tests, what I call continuous testing best practices, which is more than just test automation. It's also, the way you create tests, the way you analyze tests. So again, in this situation, they were actually training the testers after the code was written. So a lot of ways just waiting for people to get trained so they can write the tests. They really weren't following the traditional CI/CD pipeline model. So things were happening out of order. Functional testing was being done together with regression testing and integration testing. And there wasn't any demarcation really between those. So there was a lot of issues with trying to sort out what problems are happening for where. You didn't have like a hierarchy of dependencies that you could identify. So test analysis was very messy. A lot of wait time, again, between setting up environments. So they couldn't finish their acceptance until the users accepted it. So but you didn't have direct control of the users. So setting up the users to test was a big delay. So the solution here was to, again, re-architect the pipeline a little bit, make it more of a traditional CI/CD pipeline, and apply automation to test orchestration and or setting up the user acceptance testing, and also orchestrating the involvement of users, get them ready before before they have to do it. Don't just tell them at the time, but do some work, warn them.
Well, one more we'll look at, and interesting enough, we'll get into these in the next webinar, some of the remediation that was done. But let's look at another even messier one.
Yes, again, a large insurance company, huge effort on testing, completely separate test organization. During the meeting, we had a lot of trouble getting agreement as to what the times were and even what their process was. There were so many components to their testing, and testing for development was totally separated from the other testing, and there were different testing groups that were practically unaware of each other. So again, the huge bottleneck here had to do with the way they were doing testing, the order in which they were doing it, the way the tests were identified, the way that the tests were being reviewed and executed, a lot of manual testing. So again, the bottlenecks, the main bottleneck was testing and test environment. I find that happens a lot, actually.
Yeah.
It's often the bottleneck with these large firms when you're dealing with complex, multi-tiered, products that have legacy components and other things. Pulling together an environment for that to test, and then running the tests can be very complex.
Yep, absolutely. And what's interesting is, you're not trying to call you're not calling out anyone. You're just saying overall, this is what we currently do, and here's the timings, and it gives everyone an opportunity to go, yeah. So when you're doing that, and obviously you have to start planning for what are you going to fix, and maybe it seems obvious, but how.
Well, in that last one, it was kind of scary. In fact, they practically ran out of the room at one point. Everybody like, oh my God, we're not going to make our upcoming release because now we see how long things take,
right?
And we're not going to make. This is telling us we're not even going to come close to meeting our deadlines. I had a feeling that everybody was running to write their resumes or something.
But that's an interesting aspect. If you find that your current processes are that bad, step up your own career, because you can help this process wherever you are. Take this on a bit. But all right, well, so how do I know what areas I should focus on to fix?
So again, it's an analysis. You sit down and you say, well, what are all these stages really taking? And you try to get consensus as well. Again, there's no such thing as absolute numbers. I'd love to be the engineer with just a calculator. It doesn't work, right? You have to involve people, because none of these things are black and white and nailed down to that degree. You have some data, some portions of the value stream, you're going to have better data than other portions, but you try to get the best data you can. You're typically going to get that data from the people that are closest to the data, and then you're going to have to rely on it. You get back together and you just literally list out, here's what I'm finding. This is what seems to be ranked. The ranking, if I just look at the numbers, you can look at where the biggest improvement's going to come from if you solve those, if you attack those bottlenecks and get agreement. Yep, that looks like the biggest one, so we'll tackle that, right? And that becomes the basis for a future state value stream map. The output of a current state value stream mapping exercise is to give input to a future state value stream mapping exercise. And we're not going to go into that a whole lot in this webinar. That's the next webinar, but that's the general idea. Again, try to bring people along, because it is a collaborative multi-team thing, and try to present the data and get alignment as you go along, so that at the end you get acceptance of the result.
Absolutely. Well, and this is what we'll talk about, are some of the key bottlenecks, and we'll save this for next time as we look at future state. But there's a lot here that we can do as you start. Well, what are the strategies to actually reduce that? Here's your key bottlenecks. And we'll get into some of these strategies because that's where the cool. And I'm assuming for those on the line, if I want to learn some of these things, I bet there's a book that I could read that would help me learn some of this stuff. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Engineering DevOps.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And this is, a future state as a teaser for what we'll talk about next time of actually, here's where the next set of changes were. And we'll talk about real cases that was happening in. Kind of buttoning this up, just to give us a few minutes for questions. I love this discussion because it's looking at delivery of software from a perspective of value stream. So at the end of the day, we're all here to deliver value, and Forrester helped coin the term of value stream management as a platform to help deliver software and manage the delivery regardless of the number of tools or methodology. And that's what we're talking about here. I know we've been talking about DevOps. I know we've been talking about value stream mapping, but it hasn't necessarily applied only to DevOps. It applies to any methodology to help move them and transition towards DevOps. It's funny, at the end of the day, you can make a lot of transitions and somebody's going to say, have you done any better than you're doing before? I know we're more DevOpsy than we were before, but is it better? Unless you've got something in place to actually prove that, it's going to be hard to justify. What Plutora does is we are a value stream management platform. We sit as a SaaS-based solution that integrates into your current delivery tool chains, pulling that data in and normalizing and correlating the data together. We have management orchestration on top of that, allowing you to ensure standardized processes with everything, and really to take the workload off of individuals that are trying to do this stuff manually, enabling you to do this at scale and enabling you to do it for autonomous teams or legacy teams. And the best part about this is you get massive analytics because we put all that into a cloud-based analytics engine that you can then follow your nose, finding problems and finding bottlenecks and getting some of the metrics that we just talked about. And of course, you can have oversight with the pipeline. You get predictive analytics on how well you're doing. You start answering some really key and interesting questions. So with that, I'm gonna go to our final slide, which is questions. And there are a few questions. If you've got any more questions, ask them now because you got Mark here to answer them for you. But so I'll just throw in with the first one. There's a question, hey, VSM has been done a long time in lean manufacturing. So what are some of the key differences between lean manufacturing or typical waterfall and DevOps when you're doing value stream mapping?
Well, the content is obviously different, what it is you're mapping, and just the knowledge of the application and the processes involved. But otherwise, there's not really that much different, frankly. It's the same methodology being applied to CI/CD and software. You can apply value stream mapping to segments of other value stream. You can have a supporting value stream. So, you could say, if you looked at Agile as more of a way of optimizing mostly the dev end of the process, but certainly with the more recent scaled Agile and all of that, it's more end to end. But value stream mapping applies in all of those cases. There's really, I can't say there's a difference. It's really, it's really the way you apply it, right, and what you're applying it to and the content.
Gotcha. Yeah, but it's another way of saying that. I think another thing you would say is that, hey, you still have steps in the process. Maybe the names of the stages are different, but you're still looking at, you got to build it. It's like you mentioned before, you got to build it before you test it, and some tests are going to be automated, some are not, and so your phases will be different. And another related question is, isn't one of the keys to identifying bottlenecks is identifying and agreeing on the inputs to the processes and that are the outputs to, the next process?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, when you're sitting down at the beginning of the value stream mapping session, that's what you're usually doing, right? Saying what are the stages, and the moderator, the expert or consultant in the room will help you through that. But it's a discussion of, okay, let's test to see whether these stages you're telling me are in fact sufficiently defined, and do they have a defined input, do they have a defined output, and an exit criteria is the main thing I look for.
A follow-on question to that is, how much time do you spend on really making sure you define the inputs and the outputs and making sure there's alignment on that?
Well, it's the amount of time is going to vary depending on what to what extent is it going to contribute to the value. So you're not trying to enlist and list every input and every output for a stage. It's all about the particular value. So if the value is lead time, you're only going to, enumerate those things that are specifically relevant for lead time, right? If the value is quality, then, so that's again where the expertise of the leader comes into play, because you're right, you can get off on a tangent very easily with this stuff, and start enumerating things that really aren't that meaningful relative to the particular value that's being mapped. It's all about what is that value, and keep to that point throughout the whole exercise.
You bet. There's a question about value stream mapping versus doing a DORA assessment. Can you kind of compare and contrast?
Well, assessments, I do assessments. That's part of my practice. And as part of the assessment, I do value stream mapping. But assessments involve things like gathering current state. There are other aspects of current state that may not be relevant for a value stream assessment. But to me, value stream mapping is just one tool that you could use if you're doing assessments thoroughly. It's not the other way around. I wouldn't do value stream mapping alone without doing some form of an assessment, because you're going to miss some other relevant things. So like, for example, goal setting and organizational structure and all the things that are relevant for DevOps that may not show up in purely a value stream map exercise. So I see value stream mapping as one tool in a set of tools associated with proper assessments. Assessments tend to be a little more 360 degrees, whereas value stream mapping tend to zoom in on particular values that you're trying to improve, and usually the assessment is what helps you decide what that is. So the value stream map tool usually gets pulled up partway into an assessment.
Yep. And on that note, from a Plutora side, some of the analytics that we have, we not only do we give you a value stream, map, in essence, your lead time, process time, but out of that, we can already calculate the, deployment frequency, mean time to repair, and a lot of those things, because we have all the data. And so there's a lot of crossover between the two. But, the assessment, it just says, here's 4 metrics. The value stream map actually looks at the whole process and says, there's a lot more that you can change, because it's not just looking at the tooling. You're looking at the people, you're looking at the process and the tooling. It's kind of cool how you do that. It looks like just a couple more questions. When you're doing a value stream mapping session, any advice for how many values, and I think really what meant to say is how many goals that you should focus on?
I like it to be 1. I'll allow 2, but 3 is a no. It's too complicated. I usually say, let's try to pick 1, but there are cases where people have trouble agreeing on just 1. So you look at maybe 2. It gets more complicated. It takes longer. And then the strength of the moderator is really important in that case, because people tend to bounce back and forth between the different values. So I tend to like 1.
Yeah, understood. There's a note saying wait time equals coffee time. How do you motivate people to give up coffee time? True point.
you put alcohol at their cubicles.
True point. Well, this has been great. A lot of good stuff. Questions about the book, I will come by the booth at DevOps Enterprise Summit. Come connect with me. Marc will also be roaming there at Enterprise Summit. For the book, I can, email me afterwards, and I can get you connected with that as well. But very much, Marc, thank you for the time. This has been fantastic. And over to you, Charlene.
All right, great. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, good stuff, good stuff. So thanks to you both for being on today's webinar. I also want to thank the audience for so many great questions. If we didn't get to your question, please know that the folks at Plutora will be getting a copy of all the questions. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. I also want to remind the audience real quick that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the session, or if you just want to watch it again, you can do that. We'll be sending out an email later today that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can always go there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. While you're there, please check out the other webinars that we have, both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be something there that piques your interest. Again, Jeff, Mark, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.